Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Directors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, particularly to Joe once again for inviting me to be here at the MacGill Summer School, and thank you once again for the invitation to be here. I first spoke here, I think it was back in 2014, when I was Minister for Transport, Tourism and Sport. At that time, I was asked to speak about trust in politics. Last year, as Minister for Health, I came to speak about the future plans for our health service. And this year, as Minister for Social Protection, I'm very pleased to be back to discuss inequality and social alienation in Ireland. I do hope I get another invitation to come here next year, in whatever capacity that may be, and hopefully to report. Could be a senator, you never know with the current volatility in politics, but hopefully at that time to be able to talk a little bit about what has been done and what has been achieved in my first year as Minister for Social Protection. In the programme for this debate, we're asked a simple question, whether inequality is growing in Ireland. And as we all know, Ireland has only recently emerged from one of the greatest economic crises since the foundation of the state. And it's worth reminding ourselves of some of the facts of that very dark period. Unemployment soared from 6.5% in 2008 to a peak of 15%. Our national debt grew to 120% of our GDP, and household incomes fell by 16%. According to the CSO's Survey of Income and Living Conditions, affectionately known to those statistic nerds among us as the SILC, income equality widened, and Donal in his speech mentioned the Gini coefficient, which by the way is called after a person, it doesn't stand for anything, Professor Gini, and that is a measure of inequality, and that rose, it did rise, it rose from 29.3 in 2009 to 31.8 in 2014. But as Donal pointed out, that puts us not as a high inequality country, but a country of average inequality compared with the Western world, and much less inequality than compared with the world as a whole. But it has widened, and there's no disputing that, certainly since 2008, 2009. Also, poverty rates rose during the Great Recession. It stood at 5.5% in 2009 and peaked at 8.2% back in 2013. But that's the statistics, and I don't think statistics ever fully explain the human impact of the economic collapse that occurred in Ireland, which is, of course, much worse than any statistics can describe. It was a story of forced emigration, of lost homes, of lost businesses, of lost hope, and even in some cases lost lives, and was very much, and I think history will record it, as Ireland's lost decade. We have now, as a country, emerged from that very dark period. Unemployment has fallen from that peak of 15% to 7.8% now, with long-term unemployment down lower at about 4.7%. Over 100,000 jobs, mostly full-time jobs, have been created in the past 4 years. And as we know, a good job is and always has been the best route out of poverty for the vast majority of adults of working age and for their families. GDP and GNP, even before the adjustment of last week, have recovered and are now higher than at any point than before the financial crisis. Home values have recovered, trade is at an all-time high, and the deficit is almost eliminated, and our national debt is now back below the European average, a performance which 4 or 5 years ago many people, including myself, thought impossible. The most recent statistics, which are of course from the end of 2014, also show a fall in poverty, a fall in the deprivation rate, the first rise in median incomes for many years, and we do expect those positive trends to continue into 2015 and into 2016, and we'll have the numbers from 2015 in October and November of this year. But while the economy has fully recovered, it's also equally evident that living standards have not. So while GDP might be back to where it was, living standards certainly are not. And the rise in inequality, that widening of inequality that occurred during the Great Recession, has not been reversed. And again, that is evident from the facts and from what we see around us. So when people say they haven't experienced the recovery in their lives or in their locality, it's probably because they haven't. And that is the real story for a lot of communities in this state and for a lot of people. And what that means is the wounds of that lost decade in Ireland have not yet been healed. Our unemployment rate still stands at 8%, which is far too high. Median incomes are still 10% lower than they were at the start of the economic crisis. The deprivation rate is 12 points higher, and the poverty rate 2.5 points higher. So whereas Donal is absolutely correct in his presentation, inequality in Ireland is about average by Western European standards, and we're not a particularly unequal country. We were a more equal country in 2008, before the economic crisis, and it's the relativities that make all the difference. And when a country, as it progresses, should become more equal, we went backwards, we became less equal. And that's something I think that needs to change in the years to come. Because economic success is a necessary but insufficient foundation for a good and fair society. And prosperity alone is not enough unless the opportunity and possibility for prosperity is extended to one and all. There's, of course, a growing divide in Ireland between rural Ireland and urban Ireland, and we saw the features of that in the general election. Between the East Coast, where the population is rising rapidly, and many western counties, including this one, where the population continues to fall, and that was evident from the census preliminary returns last week. And a generational divide is opening up, which was touched on by Donal in his presentation, where child poverty is much higher than poverty among older people. Younger people are locked out of the mortgage market, have poorer pension provision, have less security in employment, and in many cases are, in terms and conditions, less favourable than their older co-workers. There is, of course, more to inequality than income, and we didn't really touch on this much in this debate, but we should acknowledge it. There are, of course, other forms of inequality, and for decades this state in particular was a cold house for many citizens, for women, for people who are gay, lesbian or transgender, and also for children. And even though we had a very severe economic crisis over the past 5 to 8 years, 10 years even, interestingly enough, that period was used by the government of which I was a member, and to a lesser extent the one before it, to bring about much greater equality before the law, which is the non-economic aspect of equality. And that was evident in measures such as the marriage equality referendum, legislation around transgender people, the children's rights referendum, and all the laws and actions that followed from that. So I think it's a reasonable thesis and fair to say that equality before the law has improved considerably in Ireland, and there are few countries in the world that achieve that as well as we do. But you have to make a distinction, of course, between that and economic inequality. And it is around economic inequality that leaves Ireland, in my view, a much more fragmented society than it has been for generations. And the result of the last general election and the fragmentation of politics is really good evidence of that. Many people believed that a recovering economy would reduce that fragmentation as unemployment fell and living standards started to recover. But that hasn't happened. While hundreds of thousands of people are now back at work, those who haven't found jobs feel more left behind than ever before. And while living standards, incomes and wealth have bounced back and recovered for very many people, those who have not experienced a restoration in their living standards perhaps feel more alienated than they ever did before. Without the right policy decisions made by politicians and people in office and in the Dáil, I believe there's a real danger that the short-term social storm caused by the recession could develop into a long-term and permanent rift in our society. Inequality gives rise to feelings of social alienation and also fuels political extremism. But I do believe it is possible to tackle this challenge head-on by applying a long-term vision based on a determination to put right the underlying causes, not merely to treat the symptoms after the fact. Looking across the water, I think the Brexit referendum left a range of challenges for this country over the next few years, not least in border areas such as this, challenges that are political, that are economic and are social. But looking at that referendum as well, I think it teaches us many lessons we'd be wise to learn. In Britain, it very much represented a failure of government, a failure of opposition, and also a failure of leadership on all sides. It exposed enormous gaps in British society, gaps between the generations, between the social classes, cities on the one hand versus the seaside and market towns, Scotland versus England and Wales, and also the very deep dissatisfaction that has been there for decades in the Midlands and the deindustrialised North, contrasted with the globalised new economy world cities like London and the university towns. And what happened, I think, in that referendum, and those of us in Ireland have perhaps more experience of referendums than they do in Britain, is that people voted for all sorts of reasons, not necessarily the question that was put to them. And huge numbers of people voted against a system and society that they were alienated from, as much as they did against the European Union or the European ideal. The strategy of those in power was a negative one. It's been termed Project Fear, an attempt to frighten people or intimidate them into voting to remain, lest things got worse for them if they didn't. It was an unsuccessful strategy and backfired very badly. Project Hate, the strategy of the Leave campaign, was also a negative one, stirring up dark feelings of nationalism, fears of migration, envy of the success of others, mistrust of government, and is something that appealed to many voters, as it can do here and in other states. And in some ways we see something similar on the other side of the Atlantic with the groundswell of support for the rhetoric of Donald Trump, which bears a lot of similarities to me to Project Hate. It's perhaps not the first problem with plagiarism they've had. And also we see that echoed and resembled in the rise of populist far-right forces in Europe and far-left forces in Europe, and also religious-inspired extremism in other parts of the world. The response too often of centrists and mainstream politicians is to articulate a fear of these forces, to issue warnings about them and to condemn them, rather than confronting them head-on and presenting an alternative vision for the future, which is a positive one. And in my view, politics should never be about fear or hate or resentment or division. It should be a positive, unifying, hopeful and optimistic politics. It must try to elevate and inspire, because the alternative is the angry dramas that we see playing out in far too many places across the world. To paraphrase Robert Kennedy, who himself was paraphrasing a great Irishman, George Bernard Shaw, instead of seeing the world and all its flaws and asking why, we should imagine the world as it might be and ask why not, and then how. So how should we imagine the world, and what is the alternative to Project Fear and Project Hate? And I believe what we need is a different sort of project. Perhaps you could call it Project Opportunity. And what that means is building an enterprise economy made prosperous on the goods and services we sell at home and trade abroad, one that rewards work and innovation, not one that rewards speculation. And it means building in Ireland a society and a country in which everyone gets a fair go, in which the central mission of government is to provide equal opportunities to all citizens, so that everyone gets a chance to succeed. And for those who do not, there is a strong safety net, a threshold of decency below which nobody can fall. And I think that can be done in three ways: through jobs, through services and through benefits. And that's why my department, the Department of Social Protection, is so important and so central in this. A good, well-paid job is the best route out of poverty and into prosperity for the vast majority of people. No welfare payment can or should ever compete with the salary or wages of a good week's work. So we need to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to get a good job. And to do this, we need to pursue economic policies that create an environment in which more jobs are created. Policies that support business, promote trade, ensure we remain competitive, and that we have the social and economic infrastructure in place to enable the economy to continue to grow and individuals to reach their full potential. And that's the path that the government is on. We've set about our unemployment target to reduce unemployment below 6% and to halve long-term unemployment to 2.5%, and those are targets we're going to meet. To achieve that ambition, my department in particular will step up its efforts to engage individually with job seekers, to place them in employment and train them through our network of in-trio offices and recruitment and placement services like JobPath. We'll also provide incentives to employers like Jobs Plus, giving them incentives to take on people who are long-term unemployed, and expand the wage subsidy scheme to give them incentives to take on people with disabilities. And we'll streamline and modernise and reform training and work experience programmes, ranging from the replacement of JobBridge with a new work experience scheme to reforms to community employment. And we also need to ensure that the opportunity of work actually pays. There are far too many people who get up early in the morning, who work hard, and yet still cannot make ends meet. So we need to provide for further increases in the minimum wage, rising to about €10.50 by the end of the decade. We need to phase out the universal social charges we've committed to do and have started doing already, and also expand the benefits that people get through the PRSI system and through social insurance. starting with paternity benefit, which starts on the 1st of September, and also greater social protection for the self-employed, which will be phased in throughout next year. I'm also going to try to develop and build a consensus around a new universal occupational pension scheme for Irish workers to top up the state pension that they get when they retire. And currently, half of such workers, mainly in the private sector, have no provision for a pension other than the state pension. While Ireland compares well in terms of headline pay rates, social welfare payments and taxation, much of this is negated by the very high cost of accessing services like childcare, education, healthcare and more recently housing. And these have to be a priority for government too. In my own mind, I think reducing the cost of accessing these services will do much more for struggling families and individuals than minor changes to the tax and social welfare systems. Being able to access affordable childcare will overcome a major barrier to workplace and educational opportunities for many families, particularly lone parents. And we'll have some progress on that this year with the extension of to the second year of early childhood education. But I know Minister Zappone has much more ambitious plans to do much more in the childcare space in the coming years. The cost of going to school in Ireland, as we know, is much higher than in other countries, where subsidised school meals, school books and school transport are more prevalent. And I think we can make improvements in all of those areas in the coming years. My department already spends about £3 million a year on school breakfasts, and that's something we hope to expand next year. Ill health itself is a major barrier to opportunity for many citizens and is closely associated with high rates of poverty and deprivation. People who are, because of their illness or disability, are unable to work in the way they would like to. And I think the introduction of free GP care for children under 6 has eased the burden of raising a family for hundreds of thousands of parents and should be expanded to cover all children in the coming years as part of the move towards universal health care. And when it comes to economic decisions and choices, in my mind, a €5 increase in child benefit across the board, which would cost £60 million a year, would not be as valuable to people as using the same resources and investing them to reduce the cost of going to school, the cost of childcare and the cost of healthcare. And I think for most families that would go a lot further. Social transfers, as Donald pointed out in his presentation, are a very effective means of reducing poverty, inequality and alienation. Were it not for social welfare payments, over half the country would be at risk of poverty, not in poverty, but at risk of poverty. And indeed, international studies show that were it not for the redistributive effect of our progressive tax and social welfare systems, Ireland will be one of the most unequal countries in the world, rather than being about average, which is where we are now. Studies also show that the poverty reduction effect of our social welfare system outstrips that of almost every other European country. So it's important, therefore, to protect the value of these payments now and into the future. And I believe this can best be done by indexing weekly social welfare payments to the cost of living or to average earnings and enshrining that principle in legislation. What that would mean is that people who depend on weekly social welfare payments would never again see their standard of living being eroded or falling behind the rest of society. I'm confident we can secure cross-party support for this legislation and bring it through during the lifetime of this stall. Other measures which will be spearheaded by my department is the programme for government commitment to an action plan for jobless families, which was touched upon by Donald in his presentation, the very large number of households in which nobody is working. That's a tricky area. I don't particularly like the term workless households, which I often hear used, because there are other forms of work than jobs. And a lot of people in so-called jobless households actually are working, but they're working in a care role, very often for a disabled child. And conscripting them into the workforce is actually not the solution at all. It might improve your numbers, but it's not actually going to improve anything for those people or the society, and you have to bear that in mind. And also, when we look at the statistics, there's actually a big difference between single people and households. We don't have a high level of jobless single people in Ireland. We do have a high level of jobless households, but we will do, or jobless families rather, but what we will do is develop an action plan around that and publish it before the end of the year. And also working with Minister Zappone in particular, we'll develop for next year, and the budget not this year but next year, a working family payment. And that working family payment will really have two aims. One, to reduce the very high levels of child poverty we have in Ireland, and secondly, to increase the incentive to work in the first place or work longer hours, so that no family is ever better off on welfare than in work, which is the case for some families at the moment. Just before I finish picking up on some of the themes from Richard's speech, which I thought was a really good speech and gave us a lot of food for thought. And Richard very much condemned neoliberalism and market economics and capitalism. And to a certain extent, I agree with some of his criticism. This idea that just letting the market rip and that you can't buck the market and market forces should decide everything, the idea that's a good economic or social policy, I agree, is totally flawed. And I don't like when we talk about so many issues in the context of the market. You know, we talk about the housing market. When I was in health, I used to always get memos up to me about the health insurance market and customers rather than patients. And I never really agreed with that. And at the moment, in my current job, we often talk about the labour market, you know, as if the whole purpose was to serve the market and have a functioning, sustainable market rather than being about people. And of course, our policy should always be about people. It should be about patients, not health insurance customers. It should be about homes, not the housing market. And it should be about good jobs, not satisfying the demands of the labour market. And we have a horrible dehumanising language around a lot of policy in Ireland, particularly in government. And that's something that I want to change. And I would actually agree with some of Richard's thesis in that regard. But where we would differ is I actually believe that the market economy has its values. The market economy and capitalism is probably the most effective way to create wealth and has actually lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. You only have to look at China to see the difference between a state-planned, controlled economy where there was famine to what they have in China now, which is an oppressive state, but one in which hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty and into some degree of prosperity because they adopted capitalism and market economics. We see it in Central and Eastern Europe, where people no longer queue for basic foodstuffs. There's no longer any rationing because they moved away from state-controlled, planned economies towards market economics. And we saw it in Ireland too, where we embraced capitalism and the market economy and have become a phenomenally wealthier country than we were in the 50s or 60s. But the problem with capitalism and the market economy is it's totally amoral. It is all about creating wealth and profit. It's not about the needs of people at all. And that's where the role of government comes in my view. Not to shut down the market economy, but the role of government is to regulate, to moderate and organise the market economy so it serves the interests of people and the interests of society. And that's why people from my party who ascribe to my philosophy talk about the social market economy. That's what we want to achieve. We believe the market economy is the means of creating wealth, but the role of government is to ensure that we use that wealth and regulate and control the market so that it delivers on our social objectives and our environmental objectives as well. As Shakespeare would have said, so distribution, undue excess, and each man have enough. Or if I remember my Shakespeare correctly, in a similar paragraph when Lear is on the heath, he says, "O reason not the need. Our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheapest beast." And what he's speaking there is for prosperity. People need more than they just need. They need more than that, and that's the difference between subsistence and humanity. And then finally, I suppose, just to touch on the theme of economic equality, and Richard talked a lot about opportunity, and I was delighted to hear that because I didn't know he was going to speak about opportunity, and I do think you need to make a distinction there as well. I totally believe in equality before the law. Everyone should be equal before the law, whether they're male, female, straight, gay, what their religious background is, you name it. But economic equality is something very different, and absolute economic equality suggests that everyone should have the same income, everyone should have the same wealth. And I actually don't agree with that. I think people who work longer hours should get paid more than people who work shorter hours. People who work harder should get paid more than those who don't. People who create a business or invent something or do something that makes them stand out should get some incentive for that. And we've tried absolute income equality before. It's been tried in communism, didn't work out very well. Attempts were made towards it recently in some parts of South America, which haven't worked out. It appeared to work well for a few years, and when the milk shortages and power cuts started and the child infant mortality started to rise, people who were cheerleaders for that suddenly stopped being cheerleaders for that. And I think that's why what we should strive to is equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcome. And we do not have equality of opportunity in this country, and that has to be the mission of government into the future. But I don't think we should try and make everyone the same. I don't think that would make us a better society at all. To finish up, I believe Brian Friel is the literary subject of the summer school this year, and in one of his earliest plays, he wondered what had happened to the clean spirit of idealism that fired people to freedom after independence. And I think it's worth reflecting on that spirit of idealism in this centenary year of the 1916 Rising, and how we can ensure that spirit is rekindled. What we need, I believe, is an idealism based on principle, not based on populism or cynicism. We have it in our power to become more ambitious, more generous and more reforming as we solve the deep-rooted problems in Irish society. Achieving all of this will be challenging, and in doing so, we should be wary of leaders or parties that offer simplistic answers to complex issues, particularly when those answers appear to be cost-free or place the burden on someone we cannot see. Having come through the worst recession in a generation, Ireland actually stands on a threshold of enormous opportunity. I think this is a time to be optimistic in Ireland. Our economy and public finances are back in order, our population is rising, our demographics are still very favourable, we're still a very young country. Climate change will impact on us, but not as adversely as in other countries. We have plentiful resources, plenty of seas. We have a relatively cohesive and peaceful society. And unlike other countries, we're comfortable and confident about our place in Europe and the world. And I think if other countries looked at Ireland, they would say we have a very good starting point. I think, in fact, other countries will be envious at the starting point that Ireland has for development over the next decades. The challenge for us is to make sure that we make the most of what I believe is a coming decade of opportunity, to ensure that we build an Ireland in which we can be proud, one that is liberal, is prosperous, is united, is European, but above all offers equality of opportunity for all. Thank you.